Okay, today we're going to learn how to make bias binding out of a very small piece of fabric and without having to be really precise in our cutting. This method was shown me by RH employee Robin Kukania like 6 years ago, and I use it all the time now because it's wonderful. Now you'll notice I have a square in front of me. It is about 14.5 inches by 14.5 inches. I say about because it's not precise, because I measured it and then I cut a little wobbly, and that's okay. People will say, oh, you have to cut a perfect square. No, you really don't. It's not, no one's going to die if your square isn't perfect. There's going to be bits that you throw away when you're finished that don't matter. Their edges are going to be thrown away anyway, so who cares if they're perfect now, because they're just going to be garbage later. You're not building a suspension bridge, you're making bias binding. And after all, the edges of bias binding get tucked inside and no one ever sees them, ever, ever, ever in the world. So this is a 14.5 inch square, and I use a 14.5 inch square because it makes about 100 inches of bias binding, and that's a lot. Now you'll see that I've pressed a fold into it because I folded it along the diagonal, the true bias, and I pressed it so I would see that line. And now I'm going to cut along that line with my shears. There. 2 right triangles out of my 14.5 inch square. And you'll see a lot of people teaching you how to make bias binding, and they make a very big deal about, oh, label this side A and label this side B, or label this with X's and label this with O's, and I think they're mad. They're making a very big deal about nothing. Let me show you how you sew this together. You take this triangle, you put it over here, and then you sew those two together. That's what you do. So it's really that simple. You've cut it from here, and you put it over here, and you're going to sew those two edges together. I'm going to offset them just a little bit. If you can, the camera can pick this up. I'm going to offset it a little bit so that that point is sitting over the edge, because when you open it up, you want there to be a full amount of fabric there. So now I'm going to sew it together and I'll be right back. So here I have my parallelogram, here we go, all sewn together, and I've pressed this seam open. And I am going to be making inch-wide bias because I am binding seams, raw seam edges, with a 1/4 inch binding, which is an inch folded in half and then the two ends tucked in, which means it's a 1/4 inch when you finish folding it. So I am now going to draw some lines, and they're going to be inch wide. So I take my ruler, like you do, and I put it so that it's even with the edge. And I mark some dots, each an inch away from each other. Just like you would if you were just going to cut strips. But this would be really futile if I cut these strips, because they'd only be strips, bias strips, but they'd only be 20.5 inches long. And that's kind of a pain to have to sew so many strips together. So we're going to sew them together before we cut them. But first we're going to mark them. And if you've got a good eye, you don't even have to draw lines. Sometimes I don't draw lines at all. I just put the dots in, and then when I cut the strips, I go from dot to dot. But 2 dots make a line in Euclidean plane geometry, so there's one line. There's another line. And of course, make your lines with disappearing pen so you can see them now, but you won't see them later. And don't move your ruler while you're doing it. That makes for very crooked lines indeed. Like I said, even if you're sloppy with this, you're still going to get a lot of binding out of a very small piece of fabric. And you can afford to be a little sloppy. Don't freak out if you're not millimetrically perfect, because it doesn't have to be millimetrically perfect. No one has ever died because your bias binding was 7/8 instead of an inch. And it certainly doesn't reflect on your character as a person. Right. That's the last one. And yeah, I could just cut them, but I don't want to just cut them. I want to sew them together. And the way I sew them together is I flip it over and I line up this edge with that edge. So I'm lining up the 2 bias edges with each other. And I'm going to sew those 2 edges together. Now, look very carefully. You'll see that I've lined up this edge with that first mark, not with the edge, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to start cutting here, and then I'm basically going to cut around in a spiral all the way to the end of the tube. So I'm going to line this up like that, and then each one of these lines should be lined up along this seam, except the last one, of course, is not going to line up with anything because it will be the end. So I'm going to put a very small seam there, like a 1/4 inch seam with my sewing machine, and then I'm going to press that open, and then I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to have almost 100 inches of a continuous strip of bias binding from this little weird shape. Really, it is a parallelogram with its 2 diagonal edges sewn together and offset 1 inch. I'll be right back. Okay, there we go, all sewn. Now, something I should have mentioned before is that when you sew this, when you go to line up the edges, you have to offset the first one, as I said. And then when you line up the edges, if you could see through this fabric, obviously the tip of this line doesn't line up with the tip of that line. But when you press the seam open and you open the fabric out, the line from that part of the fabric matches the line from that part of the fabric, or at least approximately. Like I said, it's not rocket science. So it's kind of mathematical. However much you come down for your seam, that's how much the lines are going to be offset. But as long as you get the first one started at that line, offset that amount, and that's where your stitching begins, then everything else will work, or it'll work close enough that the project will work. Now I'm going to cut them. And I'm cutting one layer along the lines that I drew before. And you'll see as I get to the end that it just wraps around and makes a continuous piece of bias tape. The thing to remember here is to be careful not to cut both layers. You're only cutting one, or else your bias tape won't be continuous. I'm not going to make you sit through all this because it's boring. Just keep cutting until you run out of things to cut. And remember, this was 14-inch square, and here's a meter stick, and I've got $39, another $39, three $39s, four $39s. That's way more than 100, isn't it? Five $39s and 6 inches. So 5 $39s is 5 40s is 200 minus 5 and 6 inches. So call it roughly 200 inches worth of bias tape. The 100 inches of bias tape must have been for 2-inch wide tape. I made 1-inch wide tape. So there you go. There's 200 inches out of a 14-inch square. That's a lot of bang for your buck.